This strip of bark, rough on the outside, silky on the inside, was used by Cherokee healers for 10 distinct purposes before 1910. One tree. And every single one of those uses is documented in ethnobotanical field records that have been sitting in university archives for over a century. A single strip costs under $2. The pharmacy aisle sells 10 separate products for those exact same 10 problems. And yet almost nobody knows this tree's name. That question kept pulling me forward. It should pull you forward too. The tree is slippery elm, Ulmus rubra. And the moment you understand what the inner bark of this tree actually does, you are going to feel something close to frustration. Not at the tree, at the gap, at the distance between what was known and what you were left with. A man named Mooney cataloged it in 1891. James Mooney, Bureau of American Ethnology. He was walking the territories, recording plant knowledge used in Cherokee communities, and he noted, carefully, professionally, that slippery elm bark appeared across a range of uses wider than almost any other single plant he encountered. He wrote it down. That part matters, because what someone writes down becomes a record, and records are harder to erase than memory. Stay with me, because there's one entry in Mooney's notes that I'm going to come back to. One specific use that didn't get passed down the way the others did. I'll get there. First, you need to understand what this bark actually is. Peel the outer layer back. What you find underneath is not wood. It's a fibrous, almost gel-like layer that, when it touches water, turns slippery. That's where the name comes from. Not marketing, not branding, pure observation. The Cherokee and other indigenous plant practitioners noticed it behaved differently than other bark. When you mix it with water, it produces a substance called mucilage. Think of it like a natural coating agent. Thick, protective, adherent. It clings to surfaces it contacts, throat tissue, stomach lining, irritated skin. This is not complicated. This is almost embarrassingly simple. The tree was doing something that required no laboratory, no synthesis, no manufacturing process. It just needed someone paying attention. The Cherokee weren't treating this bark like a secret. They were treating it like a tool, the same way you treat salt or vinegar. Something useful, something known, something practical enough to reach for without thinking twice. The knowledge lived inside communities, passed through observation and daily use. Practical, grounded, completely unsentimental about it. And here is where the story begins to widen, because the Cherokee weren't the only ones who noticed. By the early 1800s, slippery elm had crossed into Appalachian household remedy culture. Settlers documented it. Herbalists documented it. Physicians documented it. You want a number? Hold this one, 1820. That's the year the United States Pharmacopoeia was first published. And slippery elm was in it. Official, documented, recognized by name. That wasn't folk belief. That was the country's first formal attempt to standardize medicines. And this bark made the list. Now, here is what the 10 uses actually were, because I promised you 10, and I'm not going to leave you waiting much longer. Throat and cough irritation, gut discomfort and digestive inflammation, surface application for minor wounds and skin irritation, nutritive preparation for individuals recovering from illness, support during difficult childbirth recovery. That one was documented in multiple records and later went almost entirely silent in mainstream references. Winter respiratory illness, constipation relief, oral soothing preparations, fever management through indirect comfort, and a 10th use that Mooney recorded specifically from Cherokee practice, one that I am going to come back to because it is the one that changes how you think about your kitchen cabinet. That's 10, one tree, all documented before 1910. Notice something, every single one of those categories now has its own pharmacy shelf, its own product line, its own brand, its own packaging, its own price point, throat syrup, antacids, topical wound treatment, nutritional supplement, cold and flu remedies, laxatives. The remedy aisle didn't replace slippery elm by being more effective, it replaced it by being ownable. You can't patent a tree. You can't file for exclusive rights to bark that grows wild across the eastern United States from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. After World War II, pharmaceutical expansion moved fast. What qualified as medicine changed. what could be labeled, sold, and promoted changed. Remedies that couldn't be manufactured, patented, or branded at scale didn't get promoted. They didn't have to be banned, they just had to be made inconvenient, made unfamiliar, made old-fashioned, not forgotten by accident, made inconvenient on purpose. And there's that Mooney entry I mentioned, the one specific use he documented from Cherokee practice, the one that ties directly to something you probably already have in your kitchen. I haven't told you what it is yet, because the full context of what that use implies and why it disappeared from mainstream reference so cleanly is something you need to understand before I show it to you. The year 1820 matters more than it first sounds. When the United States Pharmacopoeia published its first edition, it wasn't a casual list. It was a committee of physicians deciding what remedies were real enough, consistent enough, and useful enough to be officially recognized across the young country. Slippery elm made that first edition and stayed in subsequent editions for decades. That is not a footnote. That is institutional validation from the same kind of medical infrastructure that people today assume never took plants seriously. Through the mid-1800s, physicians like Constantine Rafinesque, botanist, naturalist, one of the most obsessive plant documenters in early American history, wrote about slippery elm in detail. His 1828 work on American medical botany described the inner bark's properties with the same matter-of-fact authority a physician today might describe an over-the-counter medication. No mysticism, no ceremony, just observed, recorded function. Eclectic physicians of the 19th century, practitioners who deliberately incorporated plant-based treatments alongside conventional medicine, kept slippery elm in active use well into the 1900s. Appalachian community healers carried it further. Oral history records collected in the mid-20th century from rural communities in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Kentucky reference slippery elm preparations as standard household knowledge. Not exotic, not alternative, standard. This is the part nobody tells you. The knowledge didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the system around it changed. In 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act reshaped the legal landscape for anything sold as a remedy. The intent was safety, and parts of it were genuinely necessary, but the practical effect on herbal remedies was profound. To make a health claim about a product, you now needed clinical trial data. Clinical trials cost money, serious money. Nobody was going to spend that money on a tree that anyone could harvest. So slippery elm couldn't be marketed as a remedy. It couldn't be labeled for its historical uses. It got pushed into a gray zone, not banned, but effectively silenced in the commercial space. The same decades that produced that regulatory shift also produced the explosive growth of the modern pharmacy aisle. Branded throat syrups, antacid tablets, topical creams, packaged cold remedies, all of them proprietary, all of them patentable, all of them profitable in a way that a stripped piece of elm bark can never be. They didn't need to erase slippery elm. They just needed to fill the shelf space with something else and let the old knowledge age out of living memory. They didn't need to ban it. They just needed to make it invisible. Now, the Mooney entry. Here is what James Mooney recorded from Cherokee practice in 1891 that quietly vanished from mainstream herbal reference over the following decades. The prepared inner bark, softened in water, was used as a soothing preparation for digestive inflammation, specifically the kind that follows illness, stress, or dietary disruption. Not as a cure, as a coat, a buffer, something that created a temporary protective layer along the gut surface while the body did what bodies do. That use, that specific, unglamorous, entirely practical use, is precisely what modern research on mucilage has continued to confirm in general terms. University extension publications and plant science literature describe the mucilaginous properties of slippery elm inner bark in language that would have been familiar to Mooney's sources. The mechanism he recorded was not folklore dressed up as medicine. It was observation that turned out to be directionally correct. This wasn't exotic. This was ordinary, and it can still be ordinary. Virgil Vogel's 1970 book, American Indian Medicine, one of the most thoroughly sourced academic examinations of indigenous plant use in North American history, documents slippery elm across multiple tribal traditions and notes that its adoption into mainstream American herbal practice was one of the clearest examples of indigenous plant knowledge crossing into general household use. Vogel wasn't writing sensational content. He was a historian. His citations run deep, his conclusions are careful, and what he found was a pattern. The plants that made that crossing were real, practical, and useful. They didn't survive because of mysticism. They survived because they worked well enough to keep getting passed forward. And here is the final piece. Despite everything, despite the regulatory shifts, the commercial displacement, the long erasure of slippery elm from mainstream awareness, the FDA currently recognizes it as a Category 1 safe demulcent ingredient for oral use. That designation is not a loophole. It is the system, after everything, still acknowledging that the bark does what it was always said to do. You do not need a garden to access this. You do not need a prescription. You do not need a specialty order or an expensive supplement brand. Slippery elm inner bark powder sits in health food stores right now for under $10. It is available as lozenges, as powder, as capsules. The winter throat irritation that sends people to a $14 bottle of branded syrup has an older answer. The digestive discomfort that fills an entire pharmacy shelf with competing antacid brands has an older answer. The dry, irritated skin that drives a market of topical creams has an older answer. The answer grew in a tree. The Cherokee noticed it, Mooney recorded it, Raffinesque described it. The United States Pharmacopoeia confirmed it. And then the market moved on and took most of the public's attention with it. This doesn't require a garden. It doesn't require a prescription. It requires knowing it exists. One tree, 10 uses, once on the official list, then slowly, quietly, profitably forgotten. Not by accident, by design of a system that runs better when you don't know what grows outside your window. They weren't hiding secrets. They were just paying attention to what grew around them. And somewhere along the way, we were taught to stop. You are the kind of person who notices what others walk past. You watch this far. You followed the thread. You're not going to look at a tree the same way after this. Which of the 10 uses surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. I read them. The next plant in this series is older than slippery elm's first written record. The documentation trail around it is even harder to explain away. That one is coming.